Good afternoon and welcome. You are tuned into the Labor Forum here on WRFG 89.3 FM, your progressive community radio station here in Atlanta, Georgia. We are broadcasting at 89.3 FM. You also can hear us on www.wrfg.org, also on mobile apps and on your devices. And for those of you that are watching, you are tuned into the Labor Forum YouTube channel, where you can watch the program live as we are broadcasting it, but you also can go to the YouTube channel and see the programs later where they are archived. My name is Diane Mathewitz, and I'm a retired auto worker. And my co-host is seated next to me, Paul McLennan, retired MARTA worker with ATU 732?
732.
732 here in Atlanta. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Diane.
So, gosh, it's hard to believe, but this is our last program here in the year 2014. We'll be back next Monday at the start of a new year of talking about workers' issues. We are looking forward to it. We have had a fantastic past year here on the program. We thank you for tuning in and listening to us each Monday. The opinions that are expressed on this program, though, may not necessarily be those of the Board of Directors, staff, or volunteers here at WRFG. And the song that starts the Labor Forum off is by John Fromer, and it comes from a CD entitled the same as that song, which, if you couldn't figure it out, is We Do the Work. And that song is describes who comes on the radio here at WRFG on the Labor Forum and what we want to talk about, and that is all the people who do all the work. And so we've got a format where, now that we have gone to this hour-long program, where we start off first with a labor headline, and then we go into This Week in Labor History, and then we have our interview. So before we begin the labor headline segment, I just want to make a comment. In May of 2014, the Labor Forum moved to an hour format on Mondays. And very soon after that, Paul McLennan, a longtime labor activist in this city, a MARTA worker and member of ATU number 732, joined the team that develops, engineers, and videotapes this weekly program. For those of you who watch us on the Labor Forum YouTube channel, that is possible because of the work of Ozzy Ibrahimi. Christopher Hollis is the program's very capable engineer. In 2015, we will be joined on a regular basis by Tamika Atkins with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And for several months this past summer, Kenyon Beasley of the American Postal Workers Union was a member of our on-air commentators until his work schedule at the post office prevented his participation. They have all helped to enlarge the perspectives and analysis of the Labor Forum, and I thank them for myself and for you, the listeners, for bringing the experiences and issues of all those who do the work to the airwaves of WRFG. We look forward to sharing the struggles of workers around the world, and especially here in Atlanta, with you in 2015. So I just wanted to make sure that before the program ended, that Paul and I both had an opportunity to thank all of you who tune in to the Labor Forum, those of you who support the station by contributing during the pledge drives and other times, those of you who come out to our events, to thank you for making sure that this program and this station stays on the air. As many of you may know, it has been operated by a total volunteer staff for 41 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Volunteers come in to do the programs and talk about the issues and play the music that they love. So I want to encourage you, if you have an opportunity in these last couple of days of 2014, you always can make an end-of-the-year donation to the station that allows you, because we are a tax-exempt organization, a 501c3 organization, your donation can be tax, part of what you do to reduce the amount of taxes on your forms that you're going to be filling out in 2015. So if you're interested in doing that, you can go on the web at wrfg.org and click on the donate button and just follow the prompts. You also can send that, as long as it's dated prior to January 1st, And of course, you always can bring it into the studio and station here at WRFG. This is on 1083 Austin Avenue in the Little Five Points Community Center area. So I chose only just one headline for today because I really think that this is such an important issue for all of us. And that is that you might be surprised to know that yesterday the U.S.-NATO war in Afghanistan was declared ended, with victory no less. At a small ceremony in the heavily fortified Green Zone in Kabul, the flag of the International Security Assistance Force, I bet hardly any of us knew that that was the name of the military force that was has been engaged in Afghanistan for 13 years. It was taken down from its pole. And that was the name, as I said, for the U.S.-led coalition of some 50 countries that contributed troops to the 13-year-long invasion and war against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Just a matter of 2 weeks after 9/11 in 2001, the U.S. launched an invasion of Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world, with its massive high-tech military. At its height in 2010, some 140,000 U.S. troops occupied Afghanistan. And of the 3,500 soldiers of this ISAF, that name that they came up with, that were killed in these past 13 years, at least 2,224 were from the United States. These young people most often came from working class and poor families in rural and small town communities or urban centers where jobs and further education were limited or unavailable. For those who have returned from the Afghanistan war, physically and psychologically injured, the economic and political system that took them to war now offers little to no support, whether through employment, health care, or housing. There are no accurate figures for the tens of thousands of Afghanis killed, much less those injured or displaced during the years of bombings, drone strikes, and night raids. But here is the hypocritical second scene that took place at this ceremony yesterday in Afghanistan. Immediately, another flag was hoisted up on the pole, the symbol of the replacement war mission called Resolute Support, that keeps some 13,500 foreign soldiers in Afghanistan, with about 11,000 of them from the U.S. for at least 2 more years. The generals and the Obama administration issued statements declaring victory, but the war goes on. Workers facing poverty wages, cutbacks in every public benefit from health care to education to transit, higher taxes, foreclosures, mass incarceration, police violence, polluted air and water, voter suppression, and more need to know that this war of aggression stole trillions of dollars from us and lined the pockets of the military-industrial complex and Wall Street. It is critical that working people and their organizations in this upcoming new year make a priority of taking up the fight against endless war, whether in Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Palestine, or any other target of U.S. regime change. And that's our headline of today, with just a couple of days left in 2014. So we'll move on to Paul. He's bringing us a really, as a retired auto worker, a great piece of labor history.
Thanks, Diane. The Great General Motors sit-down strike began on December 30th, 1936, when auto workers occupied the General Motors Fisher Body Plant No. 1 in Flint, Michigan. The strike was not spontaneous. UAW leaders had been planning it for months. The strike actually began at smaller plants, Fisher Body in Atlanta on November 16th, GM in Kansas City on December 16th, and a Fisher stamping plant in Cleveland on December 28th. The Flint plant was the biggest prize, however. It contained one of just 2 sets of body dies that GM used to stamp out almost every one of its 1937 cars. By seizing control of the Flint plant, auto workers could shut down the company almost entirely. The strike lasted 44 days and ended in a victory for the workers on February 11, 1937, when GM signed a contract with the United Auto Workers, recognizing the union as the sole bargaining agent for the workers in all of its plants. In the next year, the UAW saw its membership grow from 30,000 to 500,000 members. One of the leaders of the strike was Janora Johnson Dollinger, who at the age of 23 organized the Women's Auxiliary of the UAW and led the Women's Emergency Brigade. The Women's Auxiliary organized a child care center at the union headquarters so children would have some place to go when their mothers marched on the picket line, a first aid station with a registered nurse, public speaking and labor history classes, and the women in the auxiliary also made house calls to make sure every family had enough to eat, and they gave advice on how to deal with creditors. She described the situation leading up to the strike. Conditions in Flint before the strike were very, very depressing for working people, she said. We had a large influx of workers come into the city from the Deep South. They came north to find jobs because there was no work back home. They came with their furniture strapped on old jalopies and they'd move into the cheapest housing that they could find. Usually these were just little 1 or 2 room structures with no inside plumbing and no inside heating arrangements. They just had kerosene heaters to heat their wash water, their bath water, and their homes. You could smell kerosene all over their clothing. They were very poor. Inside the GM plants, conditions were no better. Speed up was the biggest issue. Workers would come home at night and couldn't hold their forks in their swollen fingers. They would just lie down on the floor. They had many medical problems too, because you couldn't go to the restroom whenever you felt like you had to. You had to wait for the foreman to summon a relief man to come and take your place on the assembly line. They used to say, once you pass the gates of General Motors, forget about the U.S. Constitution. Workers had no rights when they entered that plant. If a foreman didn't like the way you parted your hair or whatever he didn't like about you, you may have looked at him the wrong way or said something that rubbed him the wrong way. He could fire you. No recourse, no nothing. The workers were kept intimidated because if they didn't comply with what the foreman told them to do, they would lose their jobs and their families would starve. You can see what a feeling of slavery and domination workers felt inside the GM plants. So on the day of December 30th, 1936, the union learned that GM was planning to move the dies out of Fisher No. 1. The union immediately called a meeting at lunchtime at the Union Hall across the street from the plant, explained the situation, and then sent the members across the street to occupy the plant. The Flint sit-down strike began. The police attempted to enter the plant No. 4 on January 11, 1937. The strikers inside the plant turned the fire hoses on the police while pelting them with car parts as members of the Women's Auxiliary broke windows in the plant to give strikers some relief from the tear gas the police were using against them. The police made several charges but withdrew after 6 hours. The strikers dubbed this the Battle of Bull's Run, a mocking reference to the police as bulls. 14 strikers were injured by gunfire during the battle. I decided that women could do more than just the duties of the Women's Auxiliary, Janora Johnson Dollinger said. We could form an emergency brigade, and every time there was a threatened battle, we could mobilize. We might make a difference. We didn't know that nothing like that had ever been organized before, at least not in this country. We didn't know we were making history. We didn't have time to think about it. The day after the Battle of Bull's Run, just from the people we notified the night before, 50 women joined up right away. Out of 12,000 workers employed by Chevrolet, only 400 were black, she said. Fisher 1, Fisher 2, Chevrolet, all 10 plants of Chevrolet, hired only white men on production. Black men were allowed to work only in the foundry of Buick and as sanitation workers, cleaning up the men's toilets in the other plants. Black men had no hope of ever getting a raise or getting a job promotion. The only black sit-downer in the Flint strikes was Roscoe Van Zant in Plant 4. The first night when it came time to sleep, there was only one clear table and one blanket. Who was going to have the blanket and sleep off the cold cement plant floor? The strikers voted that because Roscoe Van Zant was an older man, he should have the blanket and sleep on the table. Then they began to talk to him. Before that, black and white workers never got to know each other because it was a period of intense discrimination. When it came time for the victory parade, the strikers voted for Roscoe Van Zandt to carry the flag out of the plant. Conditions for black workers improved greatly after the strike. The Flint strike marked a decisive turning point in the history of American labor. The largest corporation in the world was forced to sign a contract with an industrial union representing all its workers. The victory of GM workers led to a wave of industrial organizing that revolutionized relations between capital and labor in the United States.
Thank you, Paul. I have to tell you, whenever I hear an account of the Flint sit-down strike, I mean, I get goosebumps because as someone who worked in auto assembly plants for 30 years, even though having a union contract made all the difference in my personal life and that of everyone else, I recognize some of those same issues. I very well remember once I got a new job, and when I left, my hands were so swollen from trying to work this big heavy power gun that when I got out to my car, I could not turn the key in the so the conditions of workers, even with having a grievance procedure, even with having safety regulations, even with having all kinds of rights on the floor, I think everybody knows that it's still a hard road to hoe when you are a working class person in this country. There's still a lot of challenges. So folks, we are going to have a phone call coming in shortly from Detroit from Martha Gravatt. And she has written extensively on the Flint strike and other current issues of auto workers. And so we'll be hearing from Martha in a minute. I want to see if we'll go ahead and play one of our PSAs while we're waiting for Martha to call us. So stay tuned. You are listening to the Labor Forum here on WRFG. Welcome back to the Labor Forum here on WRFG. And please do, if you have any spare change, any spare dollars after here at the end of the year, please do help us stay financially solid. Well, Martha, hi. I'm so happy to have you call into the program today. I'm sorry that you missed hearing Paul's historical recounting of the beginning of the Flint strike and the role of women in particular, but you wrote a super pamphlet about it. So thank you for calling us from Detroit today.
It's my pleasure.
So I haven't done this full introduction to you, so let me do this. Martha Gravatt is a Chrysler worker. She is the alternate skilled trades committee person. She is a member of Local 869 in Detroit. And she is the author of a pamphlet, and its title is In Our Hands is Placed the Power. And it's soon to be, I hope, extended and to be a book, because I really enjoyed reading the pamphlet. She is a contributing editor to Workers' World newspaper, and she focuses particularly on labor issues. So, Martha, so the anniversary of the launch of the Flint sit-down strike, which actually revolutionized, absolutely changed the historical direction of union organizing here in the United States, is tomorrow, the 30th of December. And so I wonder if you would describe a little bit about that episode and from the perspective that you wrote your pamphlet.
I started, this pamphlet grew out of what was going to be one article for Workers' World on the 70th anniversary of the Flint sit-down strike. And then I learned that there was so much to learn, and it was such a rich chapter in working class history that I looked at it from different angles. Of course, the narrative must be told and retold to new generations of union activists and workers. We must not forget just what it really took to win something as basic as union recognition, which was the foundation of everything that, the labor movement has won, and much of it is being taken away. But I learned about the critical role of women. I learned about how important it was, even at that time when General Motors, for the most part, didn't hire African Americans except in sanitation or in some of the really, really drudgerous plants like the foundries. But to have a union to build a foundation on solidarity with black workers and on fighting racism and the role that the black workers who were involved in the sit down and in organizing the UAW, how important that was, and the role of immigrants. At the time, the workforce in the auto industry was probably around 20% immigrant workers, most of them from Eastern Europe. And then I looked at the context of a victory. A victory like that, like bringing, at that time the world's biggest corporation to its knees, would not occur in the vacuum. So I looked at the whole working class upsurge of the 30s and how multinational it was and how diverse it was. And, I looked at all the sit-downs that took place during that really a 2-year span, starting in 1936 and the most pivotal year being 1937, because these are important lessons for today, because, the working class is under siege like never before. And those are the main issues that the pamphlet covers. And as this work in progress, I look at other aspects. For example, there was they drew up a list of demands, and one of those is very important. It was never even met, and that was for a 6-hour workday for 8 hours pay. And the demand for a shorter work week is so relevant. And also, looking, approaching it with the goal of seeing workers start to sit down again. We saw that in 2008 at Republic Windows and Doors in Chicago, because that's the kind of forceful action that it will take, for workers and oppressed people to really liberate themselves from the conditions we're under today. I looked at legal aspects around the sit down and the right of a worker, that a worker has a property right to their job, and that that was the legal argument then in defense of the workers taking over the property, so-called, of General Motors. So these are, I looked at it from a lot of different angles, but all with the goal of advancing our struggle today.
Well, one of the things I've seen some of the old film footage, and I want to make some comparisons to this kind of bold action of actually occupying a plant, declaring it sort of to be the workers' property and they're going to hold it. I want to make some comparisons a little bit to what we're seeing today from the standpoint of the fight against police violence and police terror. And the, when you see this film footage and you see the role of the police in Flint at that time, trying all the things that they did, all the kind of brutal, horrible things that they did to the picketers, to the women, to the men inside the plant, trying to starve them out, freeze them out, tear gas them out. You get sort of, I think you get a historical perspective about the role of police in protecting the property of the rich. And I was just wondering if you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that is another aspect, is the role of the state as, unequivocally on the side of the rich, of the 1%, the capitalists, against the workers at that time. They were not, there was no real pretense of neutrality, with the National Guard having its cannons aimed at the sit-downers. And, I'd say I did have pleasure of interviewing 6 of the original sit-downers who were alive when I began the project in 2007. I believe at least 4 of them have since passed on. And they talked about that. They talked about the police and, how they tried to suffocate the workers and fire tear gas into the plant. And, we see that they are still a brutal force. And it's not just the police. It's the state, it's the courts, it's this whole repressive apparatus that, pretends to be the upholder of law and order and democracy and all of that. And it was a sham in 1937, and it's clearly a sham right now. And these young people who are occupying not only public spaces, they're occupying malls, they're occupying private property, and that's a good thing.
Martha, this is Paul. I had a question. We hear about the company town idea. I lived in a company town in North Carolina that was run by Cannon Mills, and that was the merger of just as we were saying, the state and the government with corporate power. We talk about that today as something that we're seeing more and more, a consolidation of those two. Can you talk about how General Motors and the state of Michigan operated at this time, that collusion between government and corporate power?
Yes, in fact, a quote from my pamphlet, just looking at that. Flint, which is about an hour north of Detroit. Flint was the headquarters of GM and a quintessential company town. Of the 146,000 residents, 44,000 worked for GM. There was no company store, but that was the only company thing you didn't owe your soul to. The Flint Journal, the media was absolutely biased against the sit-downers. The town Flint was originally a center of carriage building, and when it became an auto industry center, the population grew so fast that the housing construction didn't keep up. And so you had auto workers living in tar paper shacks without indoor plumbing. General Motors owned a lot of the housing. People were paying rent to General Motors. The company absolutely, lock, stock, and barrel ran the show in Flint. They ran the judges. At one point there was an injunction to get the sit-downers out of the plant, and then it turned out the judge had to be recused because of shares that he owned in General Motors. Then another judge who didn't own any shares also tried to force the workers out. His class loyalties were there, without being a shareholder. So it was definitely a company town at that time.
Martha, let me ask a little bit more. Okay, so given the situation in Flint that you just described as it being a company town, where and how did solidarity come from in terms of, the strikers' families? They were in those houses that were owned by General Motors. I assume the grocery stores and everything else. So how did they manage for 44 days to hold out?
Well, it wasn't easy, and one of the reasons why it started December 30th, why that is the anniversary we're honoring, is that the UAW organizers knew that the workers would be getting a Christmas bonus from General Motors, and they felt at least the workers would have a little bit of money to tide them over. anticipating that this would, not be like a 2 or 3 day strike in the company case. So that was part of their strategy in waiting until almost the first year. And also the role of women and families in keeping the sit-downers fed was absolutely critical. Right away, the women's auxiliary was formed, and we'll just say this, that they deliberately, quoting from chapter 2 here, The Rising of the Women, the decision not to call themselves the Ladies' Auxiliary was made to distinguish this group of women from the, quote, the tea and white glove socials of the AFL Craft Union Auxiliary. And they set up the kitchens. There was a restaurant that was friendly to the strike. The owner of Cook's Restaurant, which was across the street from the main Fisher Body plant that was occupied, and Fisher Body plants, they were stamping plants, just like I work in a stamping plant. And a stamping plant was where punch presses stamp out, the doors and the hoods and the roofs and all the major and minor sheet metal parts that obviously you cannot build a car without. So these were strategic plants. And this women's auxiliary was the main body that made sure that meals were cooked and gotten into the men, and also that, the mass picketing outside the plant, those strikers also were fed. They relied a lot on sympathetic farmers who would give, fruits and vegetables and meat and dairy products to the strike, as well as bakeries donating food. And then, too, it was so compelling to the whole rest of the labor movement that was trying to organize. You have people coming in from Akron, Ohio, Toledo, Detroit, all around the Midwest. You had volunteers coming in.
How did the issue of sexism, how was it addressed within families? Because from what I read with Janora Dollinger's account, that there was tension where some of the wives wanted the men to come out and come home for New Year's Eve, and part of her motivation to organize the auxiliary was to show a united front that families had in dealing with and participating in the strike. But I can imagine that, just like in the movie Salt of the Earth, that there had to be some sharing of power for women and men to work together to make this successful.
Yes, that was one of the main tasks of the women's auxiliary, was they made house calls to the wives, and, some of them were threatening divorce or whatever, but they went and painstakingly explained what the sit-downers were fighting for, and they won them over by and large. They also brought food. They did, what might be called social work. They brought food to the homes. They helped with budget counseling. They brought the families, the strike families into the struggle. And
Go ahead.
pretty early on into the strike, Janora Johnson, who was, one of a number of organizers of the Women's Auxiliary, but who later was the former of the Women's Emergency Brigade. One of the most famous pictures from that strike is an image of her 2-year-old holding a sign, "My daddy fights for us little tykes." She organized a children's picket line very early on into the struggle.
So let's move again to the lessons that you are that you might want to offer between this historic battle, which, as we have commented, relied on the strength both of the workers to actually seize what are called the means of production, and they took the plant. It wasn't just that they withheld their labor, which is what a normal strike kind of is. They actually prevented any use of the plant by any scabs, which are workers who break a strike. They cross a picket line. So by staying inside, they prevented any production from happening. So, you know, after having written the pamphlet and after all the study that you've done, what is it that you think that that meant, both for the early formation, not just of the UAW, but of other industrial unions at the time, steelworkers and others, in terms of sort of setting a, I don't know, an attitude? And then
It set an attitude of boldness and defiance and of workers wielding their power and using it. And as you said, not only stopping their, that was very well put, to draw a distinction between merely withholding our labor, which is itself a powerful act, and seizing the means of production. That is really scary to the capitalists. And their, determination, the 44 days that they held those in the end, started out with 2 plants and ended up with 4 plants. That was the kind of pressure that was needed just to even get General Motors to recognize the union. And now, since at least, the breaking of the PACO strike and maybe even earlier, there's been this decades-long attack at just take back, concessions and more concessions and all these plant closings and automation, job consolidation, just a decimation, just even in our industry alone. And it's going to take actions like that to restore any of the gains of the struggle and to, get these capitalist owners to start to cough up a little bit more of the wealth that we produce.
So, Martha, I want to make this isn't a phenomenon that is just been experienced here in the United States. So around the world, there have been other instances where workers have taken over plants, and I think more recently, it's when companies actually close the facilities that, especially in Latin America, but also I believe in Spain and other countries in Europe, where the workers essentially have said, well, you don't want to run this place, we know how to run it, we can do it, we'll take it, you left it,
Yep.
we don't owe you a thing, it's ours, and they've gone ahead. Is that something that you would think that, the other thing I guess I'm wanting to ask is, at the time, how much media was there about the Flint strike, the sit-in, the takeover?
It was every day in the Flint papers, in the Detroit papers, in the New York Times. It wasn't particularly sympathetic media coverage, but I went to the mainstream media all the time and looked at the Flint Journal, and it was every day in the news.
Well, the reason I'm curious about that is because maybe it has something to do with the monopolization of media now. But I think that when these things take place in Central and Latin America, in Europe, where workers take over plants, there have been instances in France where they've held the boss captive inside, until demands were met. Unless you're kind of in a certain, if you really are looking for things, or you're on certain websites, or read certain newspapers like Workers' World, you don't find out about that. And so I'm just curious about the difference, if you see a difference, between the coverage that was given in the 30s to what was really a phenomenal move by workers compared to now, where there seems to be very much a shutdown of any kind of publicity, information about bold actions by working class people.
Yes, I think you've kind of answered the question for me. It is a real contrast, and I'm sure at that time they thought by generating negative publicity against the sit down that was a way to keep the phenomenon from spreading. Whereas today they just don't want anybody to know. If they don't want us to know our history, I mean, I didn't learn about this in school. You know, did you? Did you
No.
learn about
No.
the sit-down strike?
No, I didn't know about it till I joined the UAW.
Any labor history. So, you know, just as we don't learn our history, when history is being made in front of our eyes, the media is like a blindfold to keep us from knowing about it and getting any ideas.
But I guess what I want to point out now, though, is that the difference of the social media. And now I want to come back to what's happening today with both the movement against police violence, which has been, which has taken advantage of the fact that in many respects people control some forms of media and communication now. And so that when we see these mall takeovers or the blockades of interstates, it just multiplies because you see that it's happening, you know, in this town, and then the next thing you know, it's happening here, and then it's happening there. So I want to still go back to this about how each generation, or perhaps each struggle, creates its new forms of resistance.
Well, in terms of spreading the word and letting people know, we've always had to use our own means of communication to either, you know, to not only get out the news of a struggle, but to get it out truthfully. And one thing that the Flint sit-down strike was noted for was introducing what was then called a bold news strike weapon, and that was the sound car. And while the strike was in progress, some of the leaders who were not inside, they went around the whole city and they gave updates. The sound car played a pivotal role in a battle of January 11th, 1937, known as the Battle of Bull's Run, where the cops were trying to force the workers out, but the cops were sent running. They were called Bulls, and they had to run because the workers up inside the plant, they were throwing like water hoses and hinges and bolts and stuff that they were attacking the police with. But the women played a pivotal role. Janora Johnson, at one point, the sound car, the battery was almost dead, and it's a often told story. She took the microphone from Victor Reuther, and she said,
Everybody can see this pamphlet is really full of good stuff.
She called on the women to break through the barricade. She said, cowards, shooting unarmed and defenseless men. Break through those police lines and come down here and stand beside your husbands and your brothers and your uncles and your sweethearts. And about 1,000 women heeded the call. So that, at that time, new technology. And now, you know, we still depend on our sound cards in the struggle. But now social media is playing that role in a very similar fashion.
Martha, I want to move the conversation real quick in these last 7 minutes that we've got, and it deserves a whole lot more. But of course, there have been any number of plants that are headquartered in other countries that have moved into the South. And the big thing that has occupied some headlines here in Georgia is, of course, the plant that's in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the Volkswagen plant. I was wondering if you could, real fast, give us just some background to this vote that took place not quite a year ago, but now what is happening with the negotiations, or at least the recognition of a union in the Volkswagen plant.
Well, it's full of contradictions, and I invite the readers to go to Workers' World, Google my last name, Gravatt, and VW. I wrote about the situation in February during the vote, where the right-wing politicians were able to scare off enough people to where the union lost election to become the sole bargaining agent for the workers. It was a lot of contradictions with the current UAW leadership, basically advocating cooperation with the company, and the company realizing that even with whether or not they became unionized, that they were going to be able to continue exploiting the workers either as a non-union company or as with the cooperation, unfortunately, of our union leadership. Anyways, since then, the UAW has been recognized as a voice for its members inside the plant. About 46% of the workers belong to the UAW, and the rest do not. And it's for the union. They are getting their foot in the door, but I think it's a retreat on the part of the UAW to accept that substandard relationship when all these decades ago people sat down and occupied the plant, and the central demand was that the union would be the sole bargaining agent for the workers, and they should be fighting for that so that they can get in there and represent all the workers and represent them in a fighting way to address those issues. And I know one of the big issues in that Volkswagen plant is safety conditions. The workers are being hurt on the job all the time, and then being punished, not always being able to get their jobs back. So I think they should be taking a little bit more antagonistic stance towards Volkswagen and really advocating for the workers.
Could you talk a little bit, though, about the role of the German union in actually providing an international pressure point that perhaps even brought this about?
Yes, that's correct. The plant in Chattanooga is the only Volkswagen plant in the entire world that does not have what's called a works council and does not have a union that represents all the workers in the plant. And the German union did leverage its power with Volkswagen to pressure the company to be ostensibly neutral during the election that took place.
So it's my understanding that there's two levels of recognition that Volkswagen will give to, an organization or a body within the workers employed there, so that this group of anti-UAW, anti-union people also, if they can get a certain number, will be able to, be consulted or something like that?
Yes, this anti-union group can also function as a representative, quote, representative body for the members of that organization. And this is what General Motors was trying to impose in 1937, where they were saying they would deal with the UAW, but they would also deal with the Flint Alliance, which was a reactionary organization of so-called loyal employees, which was basically kind of like a company union. They wanted to say, well, if some workers want to be in the company union, we'll recognize them. And if some want to be in the UAW, we'll recognize them. And the UAW said, no, nothing doing. We're going to be the bargaining agent, or we're not giving you your plans back. So I think I've got to study the current situation a little better. This is non-majority union recognition, but I think it's a retreat.
So one of the other things is, of course, this is something now that I'm understanding that is getting pursued at Mercedes-Benz, Nissan, a variety of other plants in the South. And part of the issue, of course, is this right-to-work law and this long time, both racist, attitude that employers have always used to divide workers here in the South, so that oftentimes the workers who are for a union quite often are more likely to be people of color and women, and those that are sometimes, not always, opposed to it, these loyal employees, as you call them, are oftentimes more the privileged white and maybe skilled workers in a plant. So we've got like 1 minute if you wanted to make a comment about that.
Well, I think the key for unions to become a viable force and to grow again is to link the struggle and the workplace to the fight against racism. I've also researched the different struggles of the 1930s and the Ford Hunger March of 1932, where workers were wounded and 5 killed. One of the workers killed was carrying a sign. This was a march demanding that Ford give up some jobs and some food for the hungry, starving people. And one of the signs that was carried by one of the workers killed, it said, "Free the Scottsboro 9." They understood that that this was part of the fight too, and that's the kind of unity that we need to move forward.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to end here. Thank you so much, Martha. Real quickly, if there are some listeners who either want to get some information about your pamphlet, which again is called "In Our Hands is Placed the Power," or any other information, how could they reach you?
My email address is Gravatt, GREVATT.m@gmail.com, and I know you've covered the struggle of the Boston School Bus 4, the fire driver.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
If they'd like to go and make a donation to help the fire drivers' families, if you do that, send me an email and I'll get you a pamphlet. I've only got a couple left. It might be labor donated. It may not have the union bug, but I will print you up a pamphlet.
Thank you again so much, Martha. We really appreciate this discussion that we had with you today. And we hope that you get better in the new year. We know you're recovering from surgery. So, again, looking forward to this struggle in 2015.
Getting there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you.
All right, so listeners, we are at the end of our 2014 last program of the Labor Forum. Looking forward to a whole nother year on Monday from 4 to 5 with our edition of Tamika Atkins as one of our on-air commentators. Please do let us know if you have any comments or any suggestions for the program. Our email is laborforumwrfg@gmail.com. So that's it for today. Again, make sure you make your end of the year donation to this station. So important for working class people, everybody in struggle, and those who just love good music. Bye-bye.